The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor, each droplet a percussion note in the symphony of ambition that played endlessly in this city of dreams and broken promises. Marcus Chen stood motionless, his reflection ghost-like against the storm-darkened sky, watching the ant-like figures below navigate their small, predictable lives. In his hand, a crystal tumbler held 2 fingers of aged whiskey, not for comfort, but for the ritual of control, the measured sip that reminded him how far he had traveled from the desperate young man who once stood in similar rain, homeless and hungry, 23 years ago. The intercom's soft chime interrupted his meditation. His assistant's voice, professional and efficient as always. "Mr. Chen, the board meeting materials are ready for your review. The Harrison acquisition files are on your desk, and Mr. Davidson from Goldman has confirmed the 4 p.m. call." "Thank you, Sarah. Hold all calls for the next hour." His voice carried that particular quality of absolute certainty that had become his trademark, not loud, not aggressive, but utterly final. It was the voice of a man who had learned that true power whispers while weakness shouts. The Harrison acquisition. 3 months of meticulous planning had led to this moment. Richard Harrison, the pharmaceutical mogul who had built his empire through aggressive expansion and public bravado, had no idea that his company was about to be consumed by forces he had never even noticed. This was the essence of the first principle: plan quietly. While Harrison had been giving interviews to Forbes and Fortune, boasting about his next breakthrough drug and his unshakable market position, Marcus had been moving pieces on a board that Harrison didn't even know existed. The beauty of quiet planning lay not just in its stealth, but in its thoroughness. Marcus had spent 18 months studying Harrison's operation, not through corporate espionage or dramatic subterfuge, but through the mundane art of public information. SEC filings revealed cash flow patterns. Patent applications showed R&D priorities. Employment records indicated which departments were expanding or contracting. Social media posts from Harrison's employees painted a picture of internal culture and morale. Trade publication interviews revealed Harrison's biases, his blind spots, his areas of overconfidence. Most importantly, Marcus had identified the 3 key vulnerabilities that would make Harrison's company not just available, but eager for acquisition. The first was the upcoming patent cliff. Harrison's blockbuster drug would lose patent protection in 14 months, and their pipeline wasn't strong enough to compensate. The second was the pending FDA review of their newest compound, which Marcus's contacts in regulatory affairs suggested would face significant delays. The third was personal. Harrison's messy divorce was draining his liquid assets just as he needed capital for a crucial European expansion. But identifying vulnerabilities was only the beginning. True quiet planning meant creating the conditions where those vulnerabilities would become critical at precisely the right moment. Through a series of seemingly unrelated business decisions over the past year, Marcus had positioned his company to be the ideal solution to each of Harrison's problems. His pharmaceutical division had developed complementary drugs that would perfectly fill Harrison's pipeline gaps. His regulatory team had cultivated relationships that could expedite FDA reviews. His European subsidiaries had established the distribution networks that Harrison desperately needed. The phone buzzed. "Davidson from Goldman, right on schedule. Marcus, we've reviewed the preliminary offer. Harrison's board is intrigued, but they're asking for more time to consider alternatives. Time is the one thing they don't have, David. The patent cliff announcement goes public next Tuesday. Their stock will drop 15% in the first hour of trading. By Wednesday, they'll be receiving calls from vulture funds offering 50 cents on the dollar." Marcus's voice remained calm, matter of fact. This too was part of the plan, the controlled release of information that would accelerate Harrison's decision-making timeline. "How did you know about the patent office leak?" Marcus smiled, though Davidson couldn't see it. "I didn't know. I planned for it." When you control the timing of revelations, you control the psychology of decision-making. Harrison will sign by Friday. This was the bridge between planning and action, the moment where preparation transformed into execution. The second principle demanded precision not just in what you did, but in when and how you did it. Act precisely. Every action must be calibrated for maximum effect with minimum exposure, like a surgeon's blade that cuts exactly where intended without damaging surrounding tissue. The precise action began not with dramatic gestures, but with a phone call to Harrison's largest institutional investor, Meridian Capital. Marcus had cultivated a relationship with Meridian's managing partner, Janet Torres, over 3 years of strategic cooperation on unrelated deals. The conversation lasted exactly 12 minutes and covered what appeared to be routine market intelligence sharing. But, embedded within that casual discussion were 3 pieces of information that Torres would inevitably share with her Harrison portfolio manager: a casual mention of concerning FDA feedback on similar compounds, an offhand comment about European market contractions affecting pharmaceutical distribution, and a thoughtful observation about the challenges facing companies with concentrated patent portfolios. Torres would not remember the conversation as significant. That was the point. Precise action often meant planting seeds in minds that would grow into decisions without the target ever realizing they had been influenced. By Tuesday morning, when the patent cliff news broke, Meridian would already be primed to view Harrison's situation as more precarious than their competitors realized. Their sell recommendation would hit the market 30 minutes after the news, amplifying the stock decline and accelerating the crisis. Simultaneously, Marcus activated the second phase of precise action, positioning his company as the inevitable solution. His head of business development, Maria Vasquez, began reaching out to Harrison's key executives not to discuss acquisition, but to explore potential partnerships. The CFO received a call about joint venture possibilities in European markets. The head of R&D was invited to a conference panel discussing regulatory efficiency strategies. The VP of Sales was approached about collaborative distribution agreements. Each conversation followed the same pattern: begin with mutual benefit, establish rapport, identify shared challenges, and offer resources that addressed exactly those challenges. None of the executives would feel pressured or suspicious. Instead, they would gradually develop the conviction that Marcus's company was uniquely positioned to solve Harrison's problems. By the time formal acquisition discussions began, Harrison's own team would be unconsciously advocating for the deal. The precision extended to every detail of communication and timing. Marcus's public statements during this period were carefully crafted to appear supportive of Harrison while subtly reinforcing the narrative of industry-wide challenges. In a CNBC interview, he praised Harrison's leadership while noting the unprecedented regulatory headwinds facing the entire pharmaceutical sector. At an industry conference, he expressed confidence in the market while observing that only the most adaptable companies with the strongest partnerships would thrive in the current environment. This was linguistic judo, using the opponent's momentum against them. Each supportive statement actually reinforced the pressure on Harrison by establishing Marcus as a thoughtful industry voice who nevertheless saw serious challenges ahead. When competitors or analysts referenced Marcus's comments, they were unknowingly amplifying his carefully constructed narrative. The third element of precise action involved controlling the flow of information to Harrison himself. Marcus ensured that Harrison received specific intelligence about competitors' moves, regulatory changes, and market shifts through a network of intermediaries who had no apparent connection to Marcus or his company. Harrison's consultant received a tip about a competitor's aggressive expansion plans. His regulatory advisor heard concerning rumors about FDA policy changes. His investment banker learned of a potential hostile takeover threat from a European pharmaceutical giant. None of this information was false that would have been crude and unnecessary. Instead, Marcus simply ensured that true information reached Harrison in a sequence and context that supported the desired conclusion. Immediate action was necessary, options were limited, and Marcus's company represented the optimal solution. Thursday afternoon, Harrison's assistant called to request an urgent meeting. Marcus kept the scheduled appointment but delayed it by 2 hours, not to be difficult, but to ensure that Harrison would be operating under maximum time pressure when they finally spoke. Psychological precision meant understanding that a man feeling pressed for time would be more likely to accept the first reasonable solution presented to him. The meeting itself lasted 90 minutes and followed a script that Marcus had refined through dozens of similar encounters over 2 decades. First, establish common ground and mutual respect. Harrison was indeed a capable executive who had built something impressive.
Second, acknowledge the challenges without being condescending. The patent cliff and regulatory delays were industry-wide problems, not failures of leadership.
Third, present the acquisition not as a rescue, but as an opportunity for both companies to achieve something neither could accomplish alone. Harrison's body language shifted at the 40-minute mark, the moment Marcus had been waiting for. The defensive posture relaxed, the crossed arms opened, the skeptical frown softened into thoughtful consideration. This was the moment when Harrison began to convince himself. Marcus simply provided the framework and allowed Harrison's own intelligence to fill in the details. By the end of the meeting, Harrison was asking questions about integration timelines and employee retention rather than challenging the fundamental premise. The psychological transformation was complete. Harrison had moved from viewing the acquisition as a potential threat to seeing it as his own strategic initiative.
Friday's contract signing was purely ceremonial.
The real victory had been achieved through the systematic application of quiet planning and precise action over 18 months. But, even as Harrison signed the documents, surrounded by lawyers and investment bankers who believed they were witnessing a standard business transaction, Marcus was already thinking about the third principle: win completely.
Complete victory meant more than just acquiring Harrison's company.
It meant transforming the acquisition into a platform for even greater success while ensuring that Harrison and his team felt genuinely satisfied with the outcome.
Incomplete victories created enemies. Complete victories created allies.
The integration plan that Marcus had developed months earlier reflected this philosophy. Instead of the typical post-acquisition purge that destroyed value and created resentment, Marcus had designed a structure that elevated Harrison's best people while gradually absorbing their expertise into his own organization. Harrison himself would become president of the new pharmaceutical division, with genuine authority over operations and a compensation package that exceeded his previous earnings.
His top executives would receive expanded roles with clear advancement paths. Their innovative research projects would receive increased funding and resources. This wasn't generosity, it was strategic completeness.
By making Harrison's team partners in the success rather than victims of the acquisition, Marcus ensured their continued excellence while demonstrating to the broader market that acquisition by his company represented opportunity rather than threat.
This reputation would make future acquisitions easier and more efficient.
But, complete victory extended beyond the immediate transaction to the broader competitive landscape. Marcus had designed the Harrison acquisition to create cascading effects that would reshape the entire pharmaceutical sector in his favor.
The combined company's expanded pipeline would put pressure on 3 direct competitors who lacked similar breadth.
The enhanced European distribution network would make it difficult for smaller players to access those markets effectively.
The regulatory expertise gained from Harrison's team would accelerate approval processes for the entire portfolio.
Most significantly, the acquisition established Marcus's company as the industry's dominant consolidator. Within 6 months, 2 other pharmaceutical companies proactively approached him about potential deals, recognizing that partnership was preferable to competition. The Harrison acquisition had demonstrated his company's ability to integrate complex operations while preserving value, making it an attractive acquirer for executives planning their exit strategies.
The financial results exceeded even Marcus's projections. The combined company's stock price rose 38% in the first year following the acquisition.
Revenue synergies from cross-selling and expanded distribution generated $240 million in additional income. Cost synergies from eliminated redundancies and improved efficiency contributed another $180 million to the bottom line. The regulatory advantages shortened approval timelines by an average of 4 months across the pipeline, accelerating revenue recognition and improving return on investment calculations. But, the true measure of complete victory was demonstrated 2 years later when Harrison, now thriving in his expanded role, recommended Marcus for membership in the exclusive Pharmaceutical Leadership Council, the industry's most influential strategic forum. This wasn't just professional courtesy, it was genuine respect and gratitude from a man who had initially viewed Marcus as a threat but had discovered instead a partner who had elevated his career to heights he could never have achieved independently. Standing once again at his office window, now 3 floors higher in a newer building that housed his expanded headquarters, Marcus reflected on the deeper principles that had made such victories possible.
The Harrison acquisition was merely one application of a systematic approach to power that had been forged through decades of careful observation, painful mistakes, and relentless self-improvement.
The journey had begun in failure, as most transformative journeys do. 25 years earlier, Marcus had been a mid-level manager at a consulting firm, competent but unremarkable, progressing steadily but without distinction through the ranks of corporate middle management. He had believed then that hard work and good intentions were sufficient for success, that merit would inevitably be recognized and rewarded, that the world was essentially fair and rational.
But collapse came suddenly and completely.
His consulting firm's largest client, a manufacturing company that represented 40% of total revenue, abruptly terminated their contract and hired a competitor. The official reason was strategic realignment and cost optimization. The real reason, Marcus discovered later, was that the competitor's managing partner had cultivated a personal relationship with the client's CEO through their shared membership in an exclusive golf club, while Marcus had been focused solely on delivering excellent work product. The client's departure triggered a cascade of consequences.
Marcus's consulting firm lost 3 additional clients within 60 days as word spread about their financial instability.
Employee layoffs began immediately, with Marcus's entire team eliminated in the first round. His personal financial situation, built on the assumption of continued employment, unraveled as his mortgage payments became unsustainable and his investment portfolio, heavily weighted toward his employer's stock, lost 80% of its value.
The final humiliation came when his wife, Sarah, informed him that she was filing for divorce.
"I married a successful man with a bright future," she said during their last conversation as a couple. "I can't stay married to someone who doesn't understand how the world actually works." Alone in his empty apartment, surrounded by the detritus of his former life, Marcus experienced what he would later recognize as the most valuable moment of his existence, the complete destruction of his illusions about power, success, and human nature. The naive belief in meritocracy died, replaced by a clear-eyed understanding that the world was governed by forces far more complex and ruthless than he had ever imagined. But, from that destruction came an opportunity for reconstruction. If the old Marcus, with his faith in fairness and his reliance on hard work alone, had been inadequate to the challenges of the real world, then he would build a new version of himself, one that understood power in all its forms and wielded it with precision and purpose. The education began immediately. Marcus spent his remaining savings not on job search activities or retraining programs, but on books, hundreds of them covering history, psychology, economics, military strategy, and biography. He read Machiavelli and Sun Tzu, but also Robert Caro's studies of political power and Walter Isaacson's dissections of transformational leadership. He studied the rise and fall of business empires, the psychology of decision-making, the mathematics of game theory. More importantly, he began to observe the world around him with new eyes.
During his job interviews, he paid less attention to the questions being asked than to the power dynamics between the interviewers.
He noticed who spoke first, who others looked to for approval, whose opinions shaped the room's energy. He studied how decisions were actually made versus how they were officially described. He observed the subtle ways that information flowed through organizations and how that flow could be influenced or redirected.
The breakthrough came during an interview with a mid-sized investment firm.
The hiring manager, Jonathan Reed, was explaining the company's collaborative culture and merit-based promotion system when his phone rang. The conversation that followed was brief but revealing. Reed's tone shifted from confident to deferential as he spoke with someone he repeatedly addressed as Sir.
After hanging up, Reed's entire demeanor changed. He became distracted, anxious, and repeatedly checked his watch. Marcus recognized the moment as an opportunity to apply his new understanding.
Instead of pretending not to have noticed the call or politely ignoring Reed's obvious distraction, he leaned forward and said quietly, "It sounds like there's a situation that requires your immediate attention. I appreciate you taking time to meet with me during what's clearly a challenging day. Perhaps we could continue this conversation when you're able to focus completely on evaluating whether I can help solve whatever problems your firm is facing."
Reed's expression shifted from surprise to curiosity to something approaching respect. "You're very perceptive, Mr. Chen.
We are dealing with a significant client crisis that could cost us millions in assets under management.
What makes you think you might be able to help?"
This was the moment Marcus would later identify as the beginning of his transformation. Instead of launching into a standard recitation of his qualifications, he spent the next 20 minutes asking questions about the client's situation, the firm's response options, and the internal dynamics that were preventing effective action. By the end of the conversation, Reed wasn't interviewing Marcus for a junior analyst position, he was asking him to join a crisis response team that would determine the firm's future. Marcus had discovered his first principle of power: most people are so focused on projecting their own capabilities that they miss opportunities to understand and address others' actual needs. By making Reed's problem more important than his own job search, Marcus had demonstrated a form of value that transcended his resume. The crisis resolution that followed became Marcus's masterclass in applied power dynamics. The client, a family foundation with $800 million in assets, was threatening to withdraw their funds because of poor investment performance and communication failures. The foundation's board was dominated by the founding family's second generation, who had inherited wealth but not the financial sophistication to evaluate investment strategies effectively. The firm's senior partners were approaching the crisis through traditional methods: improved performance reports, more frequent meetings, and promises of better returns. These efforts were failing because they addressed the symptoms rather than the underlying issue. Marcus spent 3 days studying the foundation's board members, their family dynamics, their individual interests and concerns, their decision-making patterns. The solution he proposed was counterintuitive. Instead of defending the firm's investment performance, acknowledge the communication failures and recommend a complete restructuring of the relationship that would give the foundation's board more apparent control while actually streamlining decision-making processes. This required creating new advisory committees, implementing quarterly strategy sessions, and developing customized reporting systems that presented complex information in formats that non-experts could easily understand and discuss. Most importantly, Marcus identified the key influencer within the foundation's board, the eldest daughter of the founder, who had the respect of her siblings but lacked confidence in financial matters. By proposing that she chair a new investment oversight committee with the authority to approve major strategic changes, Marcus simultaneously addressed her need for meaningful involvement and the firm's need for a single point of contact who could represent the family's interests. The restructuring succeeded beyond everyone's expectations. The foundation not only retained their assets with the firm but increased their investment by $200 million within 6 months. The improved communication systems and governance structure became a model that the firm used to attract other family office clients. Marcus's role in the success earned him rapid promotion to senior associate and recognition as the firm's expert in high-net-worth client relationships. But the real education came from observing how his success was perceived and discussed within the firm. Officially, Marcus was praised for his analytical skills and client service excellence. Privately, however, he overheard conversations that revealed a different understanding. Some colleagues attributed his success to luck. Others suggested that he had somehow manipulated the foundation's board members. A few expressed concern that his methods were too aggressive or politically sophisticated for the firm's culture. This feedback taught Marcus a crucial lesson about power: effective action often makes others uncomfortable, not because it is unethical, but because it reveals the inadequacy of conventional approaches. His success with the foundation had demonstrated that most business problems were actually human problems disguised as technical challenges. Solving human problems required understanding psychology, emotion, and social dynamics, skills that many professionals either lacked or dismissed as irrelevant to real business. Over the following 3 years, Marcus systematically developed these capabilities. He studied negotiations not just as economic transactions but as psychological competitions. He learned to read micro-expressions, voice patterns, and body language to understand what people were actually thinking versus what they were saying. He practiced controlling his own emotional responses until he could maintain perfect composure even under extreme pressure. Most importantly, he began to understand power as a system rather than an attribute. Power wasn't something you possess like money or credentials, it was something you created through relationships, information, and positioning. The most powerful people weren't necessarily the smartest or hardest working, they were those who best understood how to shape the conditions under which decisions were made. This systematic approach to power development accelerated when Marcus left the investment firm to join a private equity company focused on middle-market acquisitions. private equity was the perfect laboratory for studying power dynamics because every transaction required convincing business owners to sell companies they had spent decades building. Success required understanding not just financial valuations but the complex emotional and psychological factors that influenced major life decisions.
Marcus's first acquisition target was a family-owned manufacturing company run by its 73-year-old founder, Robert Martinez.
Martinez had built the company from a single machine in his garage into a $50 million enterprise employing 200 people in his hometown. He was proud, stubborn, and deeply suspicious of private equity firms, which he viewed as corporate raiders who destroyed local jobs for Wall Street profits. The conventional approach would have focused on financial incentives, offering Martinez a premium price that made the sale economically attractive regardless of his personal reservations. Previous private equity firms had tried this strategy and failed because they had misunderstood Martinez's primary motivation. He didn't need money, his company generated substantial cash flow and he lived modestly. What he needed was assurance that his life's work would continue to benefit his employees and community.
Marcus spent 2 months studying Martinez's history, values, and concerns before making initial contact.
He learned that Martinez's father had been laid off from a manufacturing job during the 1970s recession and had struggled to find work for 18 months. He discovered that Martinez had personally paid for employees' children to attend college and had never laid off a worker, even during the 2008 financial crisis. He understood that Martinez viewed his company not as a financial asset but as a community institution. The acquisition strategy Marcus developed reflected this understanding. Instead of leading with financial terms, he began with a philosophical discussion about the future of American manufacturing and the importance of companies that maintain long-term commitments to their workers and communities. He shared stories of other acquisitions where his firm had preserved jobs, expanded operations, and strengthened local economic development. Most importantly, Marcus proposed an acquisition structure that addressed Martinez's deeper concerns. The deal included employment guarantees for all current workers, commitments to maintain local operations for at least 10 years, and the establishment of an employee profit-sharing program that would ensure workers benefited from any future growth. Martinez would remain as chairman with genuine authority over employment and community relations decisions. The negotiation process took 6 months, but the outcome exceeded expectations. Martinez didn't just agree to sell his company, he became an advocate for the deal, convincing skeptical employees and community leaders that the acquisition represented opportunity rather than threat. After closing, he introduced Marcus to other business owners in the region, leading to 3 additional acquisitions over the following 2 years. These successes established Marcus's reputation within the private equity community as someone who could complete transactions that others couldn't.
But, more importantly, they confirmed his understanding of power's fundamental principles.
True power came not from forcing others to accept your terms, but from aligning your objectives with their deepest needs and values. This required patience, empathy, and the ability to see situations from multiple perspectives simultaneously. The synthesis of these experiences crystallized into the systematic approach that Marcus would later apply to the Harrison acquisition and dozens of similar victories. Plan quietly meant understanding all the forces at work in any situation, not just the obvious ones, but the hidden currents of emotion, ego, fear, and aspiration that actually drove decision-making. Act precisely meant calibrating every action for maximum impact while minimizing resistance and unintended consequences. Win completely meant achieving outcomes that created value for everyone involved, turning potential adversaries into allies and establishing foundations for future success. But the deepest principle underlying all of these tactics was the one reflected in his personal transformation: the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This wasn't about becoming ruthless or abandoning moral principles. It was about eliminating the internal weaknesses, the need for approval, the fear of conflict, the attachment to comfortable illusions that made you vulnerable to external manipulation or defeat. Marcus's weak self had believed that the world was fair, that good intentions were sufficient, that other people shared his assumptions about how business and relationships should work. That self had been destroyed not by enemies but by reality itself. The strong self that emerged from that destruction was built on a foundation of accurate understanding rather than wishful thinking. This strong self didn't need others to validate his worth, so he couldn't be controlled through flattery or social approval. He didn't fear failure because he understood it as information rather than judgment, so he couldn't be paralyzed by threats or uncertainty. He didn't require others to share his values or methods, so he couldn't be frustrated by their different approaches to similar challenges. Most importantly, the strong self understood that power was ultimately about service, not service in the sense of subservience, but service in the sense of creating value for others while advancing your own objectives. This was the secret that weak people never grasped. The most effective way to get what you wanted was to help other people get what they needed. This principle had guided every major decision in Marcus's career. The investment firm crisis had been resolved by focusing on the foundation board's need for meaningful involvement rather than the firm's need to retain assets. The Martinez acquisition had succeeded by addressing the founder's concerns about employee welfare rather than simply offering more money. The Harrison deal had worked because it solved genuine business problems rather than merely satisfying Marcus's expansion ambitions. Each victory had reinforced the same lesson: sustainable power came from creating systems where everyone benefited from your success. This was more than enlightened self-interest, it was a practical recognition that enemies were expensive and allies were assets. Every person who profited from working with you became someone with a vested interest in your continued success. Standing at his window as the afternoon sun finally broke through the storm clouds, Marcus reflected on the broader implications of these principles for anyone seeking to build lasting success in any field. The specific tactics would vary depending on industry, culture, and individual circumstances, but the underlying patterns remained constant. First, most people's understanding of power was both incomplete and counterproductive. They focused on the visible symbols, titles, wealth, authority, rather than the invisible systems that actually determine outcomes. They tried to accumulate power like a resource rather than cultivating it like a skill. They saw power as a competition with winners and losers rather than a collaboration that could create value for everyone involved. Second, the greatest obstacles to achieving power were usually internal rather than external. Most people were defeated not by superior opponents but by their own limitations, their need for immediate gratification, their fear of uncomfortable truths, their attachment to strategies that had worked in simpler situations. Building real power required the courage to examine and eliminate these internal weaknesses, even when doing so was painful or socially awkward. Third, the most sustainable forms of power were based on creating value rather than extracting it. This didn't mean being selfless or naive about others' motivations. It meant understanding that the best way to achieve your objectives was to align them with others' genuine interests. This required patience, empathy, and the ability to think in terms of systems and relationships rather than just individual transactions. These principles applied far beyond business acquisitions or corporate strategy. Marcus had seen them work in politics, where the most effective leaders were those who could articulate their constituents' needs while building coalitions that benefited from their success. He had observed them in academics, where the most influential scholars were those who advanced their fields while mentoring colleagues and students who became advocates for their ideas. He had witnessed them in personal relationships, where the strongest marriages and friendships were built on mutual support rather than mutual dependence. The phone buzzed with a message from Sarah, his assistant, not his ex-wife. "Mr. Chen, the preliminary due diligence reports on the biotech targets are ready for your review. Dr. Williams from Stanford is also holding for you regarding the research partnership proposal." Marcus smiled, recognizing the familiar pattern. Another opportunity was emerging, another chance to apply the principles that had guided his transformation from failed middle manager to industry leader. But now the stakes were higher and the complexity greater. The biotech sector required different expertise, different relationships, different approaches to risk and timing. Yet the fundamental principles remained unchanged. Success would require months of quiet planning to understand not just the financial aspects but the human dynamics that would determine outcomes. It would demand precise action that addressed genuine needs rather than superficial wants. And it would culminate in complete victory that strengthened all parties while positioning his company for even greater future success. The weak Marcus Chen, who had believed that hard work alone would guarantee success, could never have imagined this moment. That man had been destroyed not by enemies but by the collision between his illusions and reality. From that destruction had emerged someone stronger, wiser, and more capable, not because he had become ruthless or abandoned his principles, but because he had learned to see the world as it actually was rather than as he wished it to be. This was the ultimate lesson. True strength came not from avoiding destruction but from controlling it. By destroying his own weaknesses before others could exploit them, Marcus had made himself undefeatable. Not because he couldn't be challenged or opposed, but because any challenge would face someone who had already overcome his greatest enemy, the limitations of his former self. The sun was setting now, painting the city in shades of gold and amber. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new tests of these hard-won principles. But Marcus faced the future with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered that the greatest victories were not won over others, but over the parts of yourself that had made you vulnerable to defeat. In the end, the power game was not about dominating others but about mastering yourself. And the man who had accomplished that mastery had gained something more valuable than any corporate acquisition or financial fortune, the unshakable knowledge that no external force could destroy what he had built within himself. The intercom chimed one final time. "Mr. Chen, your car is ready downstairs. You have dinner with the Japanese delegation at 8. Thank you, Sarah. I'll be right down." Marcus straightened his tie, picked up his briefcase, and walked toward the elevator. Another evening, another opportunity to apply the principles that had transformed his life. Plan quietly. Act precisely. Win completely. And remember always that true power belonged to those who had the courage to destroy their weak selves and rebuild something stronger in their place. The elevator doors closed, and Marcus Chen descended into the night, ready for whatever challenges awaited him. He had learned the ultimate secret, that in a world where most people were defeated by their own limitations, the man who had conquered himself had already won the only game that truly mattered.